Bible, Ezekiel.
We've been in Ezekiel 37. We're going to start there again and just mentioning about God's glory raising things from the dead. Let's look at verse 21 in Ezekiel 37. It says, "And say to them, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side, and bring them into their own land." And then in verse 24 it says, "And my servant David will be king over them." Well, when is this? When is Ezekiel's prophecy? That's well past King David, right? He's talking about that line, that seed of David, that promised one of David that would come and be king over Israel. "And my servant David will be king over them, and they will have one shepherd, and they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them." Then verse 26, "And I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in their midst forever." And verse 26, "And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever." And so here's a promise that God would put a place of residence, a place of holiness, a place that represents His place of residence among His people. He'll put it in the midst of Israel forever, and that will be a sign to the nations. So as we look at that kind of tenor of what these prophecies say, and it keeps saying it over and over again, it sure looks like God is going to do something with Israel, and that will be one of the distinct features that gives a witness to all of the earth about who He is and how He can fulfill His promises. So we go on and we get into Ezekiel 38 and 39. I'm going to look at this as kind of a combination. It's the war of Gog and Magog against Israel, bringing a league of nations. In verse 1 of chapter 38 it says, "And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog." In my Bible translates the prince of Rosh, which I think Rosh should just be chief or first, like it is every other place it's translated in the Old Testament. Rosh, like Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the year. Rosh means first or prince. The best translation would be, and it's got, I think in mine it's got in the footnotes, they should have just put it in the regular thing. It says, "Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal," instead of the prince of Rosh, Meshach and Tubal, "and prophesy against him." So Gog is this, it's of the land of Magog. He's the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Okay, a lot of people would look at this, and interpreters throughout many years have seen this as an Old Testament figure of the Antichrist, what we call the Antichrist in the New Testament, or the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness. Others would say, no, this is a war that takes place like maybe even 7 years before the end of the age war of the Battle of Armageddon. I'll look at a couple things here why I don't think that's the case, but anyway, that just recently, with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, many prophecy teachers around the country and around the world have just come up and said, well, what's happening now is the precursor. This is Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's the next thing on the prophetic calendar, and it's going to happen because they believe it's a war that happens long before the establishment of the Antichrist in the land. They don't believe Gog is the Antichrist. They believe that there's another one, a European one or whatever. And they believe here Rosh, which I believe should be translated chief or first, they believe that's somehow speaking about Russia, and Meshach is somehow speaking about Moscow. So I think it's pretty weak Bible interpretation, but I'm just telling you that's what some are saying at this time, and unfortunately they're spreading it like it's absolute truth. I'm a little concerned about that, but because I think this is a war, and as you look at the details of the war, you need to read through this yourself with nothing in mind as the interpretation, not even anything I've said to you. Just read it and see what it says. In verse 4 it says, "And I will turn you about, these nations that come against him, O Gog of Magog. I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out, and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them, splendidly attired, a great company with buckler and shield, all of them wielding swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Put with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer with all its troops, Beth Togarmah, from the remote parts of the north with all its troops, many peoples with you. Be prepared and prepare yourself, you and all your companies that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be summoned. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste, but its people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely. So after the Lord has brought Israel back into the land, they're living securely there in one sense, which we could say that could be a period like now. They're secure in this time. Gog of Magog is going to come against them. Persia, Ethiopia, there's a lot of nations mentioned there. Some of them are North Africa. Some of them, I believe, are like around the area of Turkey and that region, surrounding nations of Israel, and that's consistent with what it says in Zechariah 12 and then 14 about the surrounding nations coming against Israel in this thing. And it'll happen here, it says, in the latter days, in the latter years, this will take place. As we go on in verse 13, it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all its villages will say to you, have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle, goods, to capture great spoil? So there's some nations that are warning. They're saying, what are you doing? Are you coming against them? Are you coming to do this kind of stuff? So there seems to be some nations that aren't all in this whole mix of nations that are coming against Israel. Although at other places it says all the nations, but then there's some qualifiers in some of those places, all the surrounding nations in both Joel 3 and Zechariah 12. So we see this alliance coming against Israel, and it's a bad scene here. They're gathering against them. In verse 16, you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will come about in the last days that I shall bring you against my land in order that the nations may know me when I shall be sanctified through you before their eyes, O God. So the Lord's going to make himself known through sanctifying his name through the action that he's going to take in destroying these nations that are coming against Israel. He's going to make his name holy before the nations because he's going to rescue Israel from this tenuous situation. Verse 23, it says, and I shall magnify myself, sanctify myself, and make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. So he says this war is a key point in all of the nations coming to the knowledge of God. In chapter 39, verse 7, this is a continuation of this invasion of Gog coming against Israel. It says, my holy name I shall make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I shall not let my holy name be profaned anymore. And the nations will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. The reason I believe this is the same culminating battle that we see maybe in the book of Revelation that we call Armageddon, is because after this, his name will not be profaned anymore. And I would say that you can't say that if this would be a war that would take place like 7 years before the War of Armageddon, because in those 7 years is the appearance of the Antichrist. And talk about his name being profaned. His name's going to be profaned abundantly during that time. So it seems like to me that this passage, and it might not be, there's room for interpretation. I'm not saying you got to believe this. I'm just saying I don't think it's what some of the great prophecy teachers have been saying recently in our time, that what's happening in Russia with Ukraine is this war. I don't think it's this war right now. I don't think it's the precursor. They're saying it's the precursor to this war. I think if it is, this war would be the end of the age. But I think what we'll see is what will happen is this Gog will make his appearance. And so anyway, that all relates to the New Testament when it says the Antichrist, the day of the Lord will not come unless there's two things that happen. There's a great falling away and the man of lawlessness is revealed. He's seen on the scene. And here I believe that man of lawlessness is this same one, Gog of Magog, Meshach, and Tubal. And that Magog, Meshach, Tubal, I believe is that area in Turkey, which would fit good when we look at Micah when it comes up here and it says there's going to be a time when the one who's born in Bethlehem will defeat the Assyrian. Now the Assyrian is one that would probably come from that area. It could be Syria, Iraq, Turkey, all took in that area of. So this would fit that the Gog of Magog, Meshach, and Tubal that would come from maybe that area of Turkey would fit with the Micah passage. I believe it fits with all of the other precursors and things that talk about in Joel, the wars that come against that would fit with all of those surrounding nations coming in, this Gog being that person that we call the Antichrist in the New Testament, and also being the leader of this coalition of surrounding nations that come against Israel.